Good morning, Life Church. It's so good to see all of you here. It's good to be with you here. It's good to be with you online. If you're with us online, you are welcome. If you're here, you are definitely welcome. Thank you for spending your Sunday morning with us. There's a lot of places you could be, and you're choosing to be here with us this morning, and that's a real gift for all of us because that is community. And we come each week from a crazy week, a beautiful week, chaos, who knows, it's always different. But now we are here in this space this morning. So let's unify where we are right now with a collective breath together. So if you would join me in taking a deep breath in and out. Releasing however you felt when you came in. Be open as you can be to what Holy Spirit will do today in this present moment. And would you stand for this first song? Night has passed and the day lies open. Night has passed and the day lies open before us. Let us pray with one heart and mind. Let us pray with one heart and mind. As we rejoice, we rejoice in the gift of this day. Take a moment in this time we'll do a little attitude of gratitude. And let's just think silently or out loud the things that you are grateful for in this moment. It can be the smallest thing, like I am here and I'm grateful for that. I am breathing, I'm alive, I'm grateful for that. We'll just take some time. the cross, my burden gladly bearing, love bled and died, that love may grow again. Then sings my soul, my Savior God, to thee. How great thou art, how great thou art. Then sings my soul, my Savior God, to thee. How great thou art, how great thou art, how great thou art, how great thou As we're singing this song, which is about God restoring strength, God restoring hope, you can sing along, you can let it be over you, but think of the thing that you need that strength for while we're up here. That hope for, and be open to God speaking to that now in this moment. Those who hope in the Lord will renew their strength. Those who hope in the Lord will renew their strength. They will soar on wings like eagles. They will run and they will not grow weary. They will walk and they will not be faint. Lord, thank you so much for how you do this. I don't know how you do it, but you can make things new. You can restore, and you do restore strength and hope to the hopeless and strength to those who are weak. It's just who you are, the forever encourager, the forever comforter. You are so good all of the time, and it never changes. And your goodness changes us.
Thank you. That was really beautiful moment that you gifted us with. Start out the morning crying with you all. It's really beautiful. Thank you. It's hard to know what to say after a moment like that when you open up your heart a little bit like you. We all have, oh man. Just a second. We have a lot of both and in our lives. Things we're happy about and excited about and joyful about, and also burdens that we carry. And I feel raw now. But I'm thankful for that, you guys, because during the week, life happens and you kind of build up a wall and you get tough and you keep going. And it's moments like these that can take a second and take a breath and be raw again and let the Spirit of God and the people of God hold you in that space. So it's really beautiful. My name is Mindy Wolf. I am the pastor here at Life Church, and we are so glad that you have joined us this morning. Life Church is a safe place to explore faith. That's what we strive to be. If you showed up this morning and you're thinking, church, God, faith, that's where I like to be. That's what grounds me. That's my hope. That is my solid place. You're welcome. And if you showed up this morning and you're kind of like, I'm not sure why I'm here. I'm not sure what brought me here. I have some hesitations or concerns. I don't know if there's anything here for me. You are welcome. We're so glad that you're here. Whatever brought you here, your doubts, your questions, or your hopes and your curiosities, we're so glad that you're here and we get to spend these moments together. You are welcome. If you could take a moment and fill out your digital connection card and tell us that you're joining us, we would really appreciate that, especially for those of you who join us online. We're so glad that you do that. And those connection cards, we read them every week, and it is awesome to see your names come through and know that you are still part of our community in spirit, even if we are not together in body. It's also a wonderful way to ask questions, to give feedback, and to leave us a prayer request. And if you don't have the Life Church app downloaded yet, you can download that for free. Anywhere you get your apps, just search for Life Church Lancaster. Make sure you tag the Lancaster on the end. Also in the app, you can see in that photo, is a little tab for giving. For those of you who invest in our community financially here, thank you. We couldn't do any of the things that we do without you, and this is a super generous community, and just thank you. Thank you for what you do. And if you'd like to give today, you can click that giving tab in the app, and there are multiple ways you can give through that. Now, coming up here in November, we have some fun things coming up. The first is worship night on Thursday, November 10th at 7 p.m. So if you just enjoyed the moments we just shared together, there will be more. You can expect singing, laughing, talking, also quiet and prayer and rest and renewal. You can bring your kids in. Families are welcome. We do not give extra childcare for worship nights. Everyone is welcome to come in. So that is Thursday, November 10th at 7 p.m. And the next, our very own Todd Bookman, who spoke a few weeks ago, he is hosting a game night on Saturday, November 12th. That'll be right out in the lobby. I learned last week, do not bring Uno and do not bring Monopoly. I got laughed off the stage for those. So not Uno and not Monopoly. I'm sorry, I don't know how that lands for you. Other games welcome. Or you can just show up and play whatever games they have. So those are two fun things as fall is settling in. I hope that you can find spaces where you can make connections with people and find community during this season. Now next, I get the delightful pleasure of introducing to you my friend and coach, Mike Goldsworthy. He is joining us here today from California. He has been a good friend to me and a coach to me and a good friend to Life Church for the last year through a lot of the transitions we've been through. I don't know how it would have turned out without him. Calling him and texting him and emailing him, hey, what do you think about this? What are your ideas about this? Have been so helpful. He's a very supportive human being. He was a pastor for 19 years, and for the last 3 years has been doing all kinds of different things, coaching, consulting, advising, serving on boards, gathering pastors, caring for pastors. Like, seriously, he does a ton of things. He's just a genuinely good human being. To be with Mike is to be encouraged and to be supported, and he's a really good preacher. He teaches preaching. So we are in for a treat this morning when he comes and shares his heart with us. So Mike, thank you for these moments that you're giving to us here. We're really glad that you're here and thankful for you.
Thanks, Mindy. That was much kinder than people who live near me would say about me. Um, it is good to be with you, sisters and brothers of Life Church. This, I genuinely think, is a really, really special church. There's really unique things that are happening here. If you have been around here for a while, I think you know that that's true, that this is a really special place. If you're newer here and you're just kind of like checking out Faith or checking out this church, I hope that you experience a little piece of the uniqueness and how special this community is. And even one of the things that I just want to like name that I think is really significant at this moment in the life of your church is the fact that you have an entire staff team that is all female. And uh, the lady made everybody clap for that. Well, but like it would be so normative, we would not think anything of it to have a church staff team that would be all men. Like it would just be normative and usual. And to have an entire staff team that's all women, I don't think that needs to be what is always true here. I don't think that needs to be like the ideal that we always pursue, but I think it's something that should be named and celebrated and recognized that in this moment, in this place, that there's something really unique and special that's happening here. And a piece of that is creating space to say that we're going to be led by a group of strong, significant, powerful, thoughtful women who are going to help lead us in this next season. And so I'm so grateful for that team, and I'm grateful that you all would create space for that to be true here. Now, I bring you greetings from Long Beach, California, where I've lived for 22 years, and for 19 years, I pastored there, as Mindy was saying. And over those 19 years, I started there 2 weeks after I had gotten married. So the vast majority of my adult life was lived at this church, and they saw a lot of different evolutions of me. They saw a lot of different evolutions of me in sort of my thought life and belief life and worldview and sort of those things that happen as you grow and mature. But they also saw a lot of like physical evolutions of me that would be noticeable. And one of the things was when I first like grew out my beard, I had this baby face for a while, and I became the lead pastor of this church and was like, I need to look like an adult. And so I started growing some facial hair to try to look like an adult. And when I first grew out my beard, it was not kind of the like wussy beard that I have now. It was much more like Zach, who is up on bass here. Like it was a good burly beard. I mean, like so much so that I was doing some work with an organization in another state. And this was before like remote work became popular, and so I was just kind of helping out with some things, and they said, well, hey, because you won't be with us in person, and people are just going to interact with you on the phone or over email, would you send us a picture of yourself so that people have an idea of who they're interacting with? And so I sent them a photo, and one of the guys on the team emailed me back, and actually emailed the team back and said, he looks like he could chop down a tree just by staring at it. Like that's how good this beard was. I just want to make sure that you get an idea of this. And so my church is constantly looking for ways to connect with me, because if I haven't interacted with you yet, when we interact, you will figure out, like, you'll walk away saying, gosh, Mike was kind of awkward. And that is most people's experience of me, that I'd preach in my church and people would be like, I think I want to get to know him. And then they would talk to me for 5 minutes and they'd be like, that was a terrible idea. It was just awkward interaction, but people were wanting to find connection points. So people would constantly be looking for, like, what's something that we can, like, have as this thing that helps us relate? And one of the things began to be when I grew out this beard that people would ask me about it. Hey, Mike, what's it like to have a beard? Like, this is what it's like being a pastor when people don't know how to connect with you, that they're like, he's got a beard, let's ask him about that. So people would, and I would start to develop, like back pocket responses to that I could just pull out. And I would say, like, oh, I had no idea how much maintenance was involved in having a beard, because it's actually a lot of work. And I thought a beard is what you do when you're just trying to like let yourself go and not care. And it's actually not true. Like there's like lotions and there's waxes and there's special washes and combs, and like you got to do all kinds of things to maintain it. So I would say that all the time. And I had this one particular time that after I had preached, a couple in our church who was more mature than me by maybe like 30 years, they came up to me to like try and connect, and they said the thing that so many people have been saying, like, hey, Mike, what's it been like to have a beard? And the answer that I gave this couple was different than any other answer I'd given before. I changed my wording just slightly. This time I said, I had no idea how much manscaping was going to be involved. And the woman, like her eyes got really big, and she looks at me and she goes, what did you say? And I said, yeah, man, like I find I have to manscape all the time. I never had to manscape before, but now I'm like manscaping multiple times a week. And did you know that there are all these like things that you can buy for manscaping that are helpful, like that I just have to do? And I just kept saying manscaping, manscaping, manscaping. And she leans in really close because there's a lot of people around, and she was clearly embarrassed. She leans in really close, and she goes, I don't think that means what you think that it means. And I just kind of giggled, and as I walked away, I pulled out my phone, and I Googled manscaping, which I do not recommend doing because it will throw off your algorithm. And that phrase, I don't think that means what you think that it means, has become for me a sort of mantra of my experience of my faith journey. That there are these moments and these times where as I grow and as I evolve and as I change, that I look back at things and I have these moments and times where I'm able to look and say like, oh, I've been holding on to this thing and I don't think that means what I think that it means. And as I've tried to sort of make sense of that, there's a story from the gospel accounts, which are the stories of Jesus that have been recorded and passed on for us. There's a story in the gospel accounts that Mark tells us of this encounter that Jesus has that's begun to help me have a little bit of framework and to sort of make sense of that experience in my own life and in the life of people that I get to work with. In fact, here's how the story goes. It's going to be up on the screens. It starts in Mark chapter 8. Mark writes this, verse 22. He says that they, and he's talking about Jesus and their disciples, they came to Bethsaida. And some people brought a blind man and begged Jesus to touch him. He took the blind man by the hand. He led him outside the village. When he had spit on the man's eyes and put his hands on him, Jesus asked, do you see anything? He looked up and he said, I see people. They look like trees walking around. So, I mean, here's the story at this point, that there is this blind man who's been brought to Jesus, and what Jesus does is this, like, strange act. He spits on the man's eyes, and then he puts his hands on him, and the result of this instance is the one time that we have recorded where Jesus' healing doesn't fully take. The man isn't fully healed. He sees, but he doesn't see clearly. He sees, I see people, but they're like trees walking around. He sees, but he doesn't see what's fully there. And when you read scholars and try to make sense of like what is happening in this moment, in this instance, you get all kinds of takes. You get all kinds of different angles. You get all kinds of ways that people are trying to make sense of this. But the one thing that you find consistent amongst almost every scholar that I've engaged with in this is that they agree on this, that Mark is writing this gospel account and is making editorial decisions about what do I include in this, what do I not include, where do I put these stories, where, like, how do they sort of line up? As Mark is putting all this together, one of the decisions that Mark has made is that this story is a turning point in his gospel account, in the story of Jesus, that it's this turning point that signifies this shift that the disciples experience, where earlier on, before this instance, the way the disciples, the followers of Jesus, could be described is the way that Jesus describes them just a few verses earlier in verse 18. That here's what Jesus says to his disciples. He says, do you have eyes but fail to see and ears but fail to hear? You have the apparatus, the ability to see, but you actually can't see. You have the apparatus, the ability to be able to hear, but you actually can't hear. And what's happening in this moment, it's this way of saying that you have some understanding, but you actually don't fully understand. And where Mark includes this story in the way that he records the gospel account of Jesus is that this man in Bethsaida serves as this transition point where the followers of Jesus are transitioning from unseeing to seeing, from having eyes to see but not being able to see clearly, to beginning to be able to see. And our own faith and our progression of faith, our sort of evolution of faith, is a series of experiences that are like that, where we develop an understanding of something and we dismantle that understanding. We develop an understanding and then we're confronted with things. We bump up against things. It's like we have new information. We have new experiences. We have new insight. We have new depth of wisdom, which then causes us to come to a realization where we start to say at times, oh, I don't think that meant what I thought that it meant. It causes us to come to a realization that I had been able to see, but I hadn't been seeing clearly. And my guess is that that's a lot of us in this room, what we have experienced. Maybe you went through a season where you felt like you could see. Maybe for you, maybe some of your stories that you were brought up in the church. And as a result of sort of being raised in the church, you had a certain lens and a certain framework that had been handed down to you, a certain lens and framework of how you made sense of the world. And then you went to college. And at college, that worldview began to be enlarged. Or maybe what happened for you is that you got new and different information than you had before about things like the scriptures, your sacred text. You got new and different information about how the scriptures were put together. You got new and different information about the way that these sacred texts had been used in history to propagate some of the most horrific and violent evil you got new and different information than you'd had before, and you were like, I don't know what to do with this. I thought I had seen before, and now this is messing me up a bit. Or maybe for you, what had happened in your story is that you came to faith in a kind of faith community that had a fairly narrow and rigid view of God and what God is like. Fairly defined rules and boundaries as to what it meant to belong as a part of the community of God's people. And then you begin to meet other people who didn't fit in those narrowly defined boundaries. And they were good and beautiful people. You began to encounter other people who believed in that same God and who read these same sacred texts but were understanding them differently. We're in fact reading the exact same words, but we're like seeing them played out in different kinds of ways, and you had to try to start to make sense of that. Or you began to experience disillusionment with people who, in that narrowly defined view of God and in that rigid sort of community, had been held up as teachers and leaders, and you began to experience disillusionment with them. The curtain had been pulled back a bit. Your eyes had been opened a little bit more, and you're like, how are we holding these people up? And you're trying to figure out, like, what do I do with that? Have any of you had any kind of experiences like that in your faith journey? Yeah. And so you have this experience and you have some new understanding, and the way that faith worked for you before, like the actual engagement with it, the things that you're doing, no longer works for you anymore. Or maybe the understanding that you had of it, the way that you thought about things, no longer makes sense to you anymore. You have that kind of experience. You have that, I don't think this means what I thought that it meant experience. You come up to this moment, these times, moments, not just one, but multiple times, where you begin to realize, I had been able to see, but I actually hadn't been seeing clearly. And here's the thing. All of that is normal. It's a normal part of faith's progression. I mean, you see this kind of journey, you see this kind of progression being written about by the ancient mystics, hundreds and even more than 1,000 years ago, we see this being written about by ancient mystics. We find contemporary behavioral psychologists who have studied it and see the same sort of pattern and movement being played out across all different kinds of faith communities. But many of us don't necessarily even need to know that this was written about by ancient mystics, and we don't need to be engaging in the contemporary work being done by behavioral psychologists, because we have seen it and experienced it for ourselves. We ourselves have gone through it. We know that this is true because we have lived it. And so the problem is, though, that in many of our church experiences, we have made this kind of process abnormal. We have made it like that's not what's supposed to happen. And so we give labels and terms that make that kind of experience seem like it is something that is more destructive than what it actually is. And so we give it labels in terms like the moniker that's being used sort of popular in sort of like popular colloquial sort of Christian circles right now is deconstruction. Have you heard that term? Have you used that term? And like if that term works for you and that term is helpful in making sense of your journey, then like by all means use it. If it's helpful for you, you should use it. If it's helpful for you as a community of faith to talk about things in that way, you should use it. I find myself using it at times when I engage with people because it's a sort of shorthand that's in the water right now that people sort of like generally know what that means. But I have also often wondered if a term like that carries with it a more destructive connotation than it actually needs to. Because what it's describing is not something that's abnormal and destructive, but is actually something that is a very normal part of a process of our faith journey. And because we haven't seen it as a normal part of our faith journey, one of the things that we have started to do is that we will look back at where we came from, at earlier experiences of our faith, at earlier situations of our faith, at earlier understandings of our faith. We will look back at our earlier formation experiences, and we will sometimes look back at those things with disdain. And I wonder if instead we could see it differently. I wonder if we could look back and instead see those things as a part of our journey, as a part of our development. If we could see it like this first experience that this man in Bethsaida has, that he's been touched by Jesus and he can see, which is a step better than where he was before, because before he had that experience, he couldn't see. And so he can see, but he can't see clearly. And so we're no longer at where we used to be, but maybe we did need it at that time and at that place. And maybe we wouldn't be where we're at today without some of those experiences. Because sometimes where it starts is the same place where it started for this man in Bethsaida. Sometimes where it starts is being able to see, but not clearly, before you can move into other places. Now, I hope that you hear this. That doesn't mean that everything that happened in those earlier experiences was good and right. It doesn't excuse trauma or abuse that happened in those places. It's not about sweeping that kind of stuff under the rug, but it is about looking back and saying, like, is there some value in some of where I came from? Are there some things that I could take with me? Are there some things that, like, I was actually able to get to where I am because of that? Sometimes when I'm working with people who are on these sort of faith journeys, the metaphor that I'll use to talk about it with them is one, I think it's an incomplete metaphor, like all metaphors are, and it falls short a bit, but I think it's a good starting point that gives us some handholds. I'll say to them, like, think about the way that we might teach our kids to cross the street. There might be an age or a developmental stage where you tell them, you are never allowed to cross the street. Because that's what they need at that age. That's what would make most sense for them. That's what they're able to process. Don't ever cross the street. But then a little bit later, as they grow and they develop a bit more, you might then say to them, well, you can cross the street, but you can only cross the street when there's an adult with you and you're holding their hand, which expanded it a bit for them. But then a bit later, you might say to them, well, you can cross the street, but you can only cross the street during these times of day because we know that's when there's going to be less cars. You can only do it when at this specific part on our street, and you can only do it, like, look both ways, make sure there's absolutely no cars on the street at all that are coming, and then you can cross the street. So we've, like, expanded it a bit more. But the thing about all of those statements is that they are all absolute statements. This is the only time you can do it. This is when it's right. This is when it's wrong. But at each stage, those statements begin to change a bit, don't they? At each stage, those statements begin to expand a bit, don't they? At each stage, they begin to give a bit more agency, a bit more room. They start to allow for some discernment. And here's the thing, is that you and I now, we are big boys and big girls, and we can cross the street by ourselves when we decide to. And we won't even think about those sorts of things anymore, will we? Because they become naturally ingrained in us. Because what happened is, what we do now is we use wisdom and discernment that has worked its way into our bodies. And the way that it's worked its way in there is because of those earlier foundational stages that allowed us to get to a point where we could be more expansive and more free in the way that we do that. And so we could look back. We could look back at those earlier times and we could say, I was lied to. I can cross the street whenever I want. I was lied to. I don't have to hold the hand of an adult with me. Or we could look back and we could recognize, like, I needed that then. That's where I was at then, and I needed that. And I wouldn't be where I'm at today without that foundation and that framework that helped me to get there. And of course you have outgrown it. You're meant to outgrow it. Because that's what we do when there's a proper foundation that's been set. And that maybe one of the things that's damaging us in the church today, and this is what the church has done, this is not what the people of the church has done, but this is what leaders, people like me, have done in the church, and why it's been damaging is because we will often create systems and structures and language and ideas in the church that say you can never grow past the stage where you need an adult to hold your hand. And a lot of that has to do with fear. A lot of that has to do with not having room for trust for other people. There's all kinds of reasons why we have done that. But churches have created systems and structures that say you're always going to need the adult to hold your hand when you cross the street. And so there begins to be fear when that is no longer the thing. There begins to be labels when that's no longer the case for you. There begins to be disdain for you when that is not where you're at anymore. It doesn't create the room and capacity for you to grow and mature and become that adult. So of course, you should grow past those stages. But of course, you also needed those stages. I had this experience a few months ago where I had grown up in this little church that was, in a lot of ways, I didn't realize it until later, was at least semi-fundamentalist in some ways. And the things that are true of this church are things that, like, I spend my career trying to help churches work through and dismantle and not be a part of their culture. That it was an incredibly, incredibly patriarchal church. You couldn't serve communion if you're female. You would never have a woman preaching from stage. You would never have any of that sort of experience. It was a church that, before it became widespread and talked about more frequently, that Christian nationalism had sort of wed its place in there, where you have a sort of view of country and a view of faith that begin to interlink in a way that's incredibly destructive. They would teach things like, I was in a class in my high school where they taught us, in my high school group as a part of the church, where they taught us that if we don't believe that the earth is 6,000 years old, then we don't believe that the Bible's true, and we're probably going to hell. There's a lot of things that this church would say today that I'm going to hell for. But a few months ago, I had gone back to that church because they're having a celebration of the pastor, 30 years that he had been at the church, and he had been meaningful to me. It's like complicated feelings, right? Like he had invested in me and cared for me, and I'd actually dated his daughter for 5 years. So we had this relationship that mattered, and he had also been a part of like those systems and all of that. But I went back to that church and was a part of that day and that celebration with him. And when I left, I got in my car and I just started weeping. I was like, gosh, where is this coming from? And as I processed it, I began to realize that there was this longing that was there for an experience that I had had at that church that I have not had in any other church since I had been there. There was a kind of community that I experienced there that I hadn't experienced since. That these were women and men who in a lot of ways helped raise me, that I was in and out of their homes and they were in and out of my home, that they were with me for the first 18 years of my life and invested time and energy and effort. And we see the world in very different ways. There were women and men who were there who were fighting with me on Facebook over things and have said some nasty things about me. But then when I show up in the room, who embrace me. Like it's this like sort of like complicated kind of thing. But the thing that I realized was, gosh, I had this experience while I was there of community that in every church I've been in since then that will use phrases like "we do life together" does not compare to the kind of life together experience that I had in that place at that time. And so I can look at all of the destructive things that they're doing, and I can acknowledge all of that's true, and I can work to dismantle those things in the church, and at the same time I can also have gratitude for that peace that was there, that was meaningful and was such an important part of my life. Women and men who first introduced me to the God of love, and who I would have different understandings of how that works itself out and what that means today. But they're the ones who first even gave me that sort of language. Sometimes first you have to see, but not clearly, before you're able to start seeing more clearly. Which is what happens in this encounter with the man in Bethsaida that Jesus has. Here's what happens a bit further on in the story, verse 25, if we could put that up. It says that once more Jesus put his hands on the man's eyes. Then his eyes were open, his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. I love the way that there's this woman named Sarah Root, and she identifies with the Quaker faith tradition. And I love the way that she translates this. She's a translator of ancient literature, and she recently produced a translation of the gospel accounts. And I found it to be a sort of fresh, helpful engagement of the gospel accounts for me. And here's how she translates this. She writes, "He saw with his eyes wide open, he saw everything clearly and in focus." Mark is using this story in his gospel as a way of showing how his disciples used to see Jesus, but not clearly, and how they go through a shift where they begin to see him more clearly and more in focus with their eyes wide open. And really, that's the journey of faith that you and I will continue to go on. We spend a bit of time walking around where we can see, but not clearly, and then we bump up against something. We bump up against something that causes that into question, and we can open ourselves up in that moment to receive a little bit more sight and to see a little bit more clearly. And we will start down some paths as a result of that experience and that encounter or that knowledge, whatever it is that sets us off. And what will happen is as we're on that path, we will bump up against something else. And in those moments, we have to decide, will I continue to push forward on this path and to double down on it? Or will I open myself up to recognize maybe I wasn't seeing as clearly as I thought I was? Could I see a little bit more? Could I open myself up and I'll see a little bit more clearly? The thing is, we continually end up in places where we think we are seeing really clearly, and what we have to do is constantly remind ourselves, constantly allow for the fact that maybe we will keep bumping up against things that will say, oh, maybe you weren't seeing as clearly as you thought you were. To constantly allow for the reality that we will continually have experiences where we'll have those moments that, like, oh, I don't think that means what I thought that it meant. This became really tangible and helpful for me in an experience I had with my friend, Rogelio. Rogelio is a really gifted artist, and I'd always wanted to learn how to draw. Like, I'm a terrible artist. I spent the first 2 years of college pursuing architecture before I felt a call into ministry, but I was like the worst person at drawing in all of my architecture classes. And so here's a picture of Rogelio teaching me to draw. He began coming over once a week and teaching me to draw, and like, this is the candid, pose for Instagram really quick thing as we do this. And one of the things that Rogelio would have me do every time that we got together is he would pick out an object in the room. And he'd say, okay, Mike, what I want you to do is I want you to look at that object. I want you to put your pencil on the paper. And I want you to not look at the paper at all. But instead, I want you to just look at that object. And what I want you to do is I want you to trace that object with your eyes. And as you follow along with your eyes and all of the contours and all of the details of that object, follow along with your pencil as you do that. And maybe some of you who have spent time in art classes, you've done this kind of work. It's called a blind contour, where you don't look at what you're creating and you're just doing it. So he has me do this several times, and he keeps having me do it. And finally, I was like, Rogelio, like, why are you having me do this? Because this looks worse than what I could draw, like, on my own before. I feel like I'm not getting better, I'm getting worse. And he told me, he said, Mike, here's the thing. You have to unlearn how you are seeing things. So, because the way that our brains work is that it creates shortcuts. Because our brains have to figure out how to use energy efficiently. And so what our brain will do is it'll create all these kinds of shortcuts. He said one of the shortcuts is, like, for instance, like, you have an idea of what a nose is. And if you're drawing somebody's face, you're always going to draw what your mind tells you a nose looks like. That's why every nose looks the exact same, and it's that weird triangle thing that you do every time, because that's what your brain is using as a shortcut to do this. And he said, so what you have to do is you have to do these regular practices that help you to start seeing more clearly what's actually there. Because what you're going to do otherwise is you're going to default and project onto the thing what's already in you and what you think you need to see there. And so you have to all the time be doing this practice that helps you to unlearn the way that you're seeing, to be open to see the thing for the way it really is. And I think that's, my friends, the way that, like, our faith journey looks a bit. It's this recognition that we're all approaching all of these things. We've got all of this stuff that's there, and it's not about pretending like it's not there. It's about being willing and open to say, can I unlearn? Can I be willing to intentionally unlearn the way that I've been seeing that thing in order to see it more clearly and more in focus? Can I be open to that as a part of my intentional journey? So here's what I want to suggest to you is maybe just one little practice that we could do. It's something called a breath prayer. Breath prayers are this ancient way that Christians have prayed for a long time, as this way of having simple prayers that as we breathe in and breathe out with the rhythm of our breath, that we practice a prayer. And what I've begun to develop over the years are just a series of breath prayers. Some people might call them even mantras at times, that have been, for me, helpful ways for me to engage with the God of the universe in the thing that I need to grow in and be open to at that moment. And so maybe here's what we could do is we could practice just a really simple breath prayer that we could use at those moments where we find ourselves bumping up against something that it's like, oh, I don't think that means what I thought that it had meant. And we have a choice to make. Will I be open to that next and new journey, or will I double down on where I already am? And maybe what we could do is just a simple breath prayer where we breathe in and say, God, and we breathe out and we say, help me see more clearly. Maybe not even help me see clearly, because I think we keep having to see more clearly. If we ask to see clearly, I think we will get to a point where we think we are the ones who are seeing clearly, and we'll shut ourselves off. So I've learned to instead say, help me see more clearly. In fact, maybe that's what we could do is, as I close out my time with you here, if you're open to it and you wouldn't mind, if you would kind of get comfortable in your chair, close your eyes, even open up your hands if that sort of posture is helpful for you. And just take some time to breathe. And breathe in, God. As you breathe out, help me see more clearly. God, help me see more clearly. God, help me see more clearly. When you have those moments where something is bumping up against the way that you have been used to seeing things, God, help me see more clearly. When you have those moments where even the new way that you have discovered is being called into question, and you're tempted to double down and to dig in your heels and become a new kind of fundamentalist who is just another fundamentalist just with different views. Maybe you breathe in at that moment. God, help me see more clearly. When you encounter somebody who has a different worldview than you, and you find your chest tightening up a bit as you're around them, and you find yourself a bit anxious, maybe you just take a breath. God, help me see more clearly. God, help me see more clearly. And so, good and gracious God, I am grateful for the women and men in this room and the individual stories and the individual journeys that have been a part of their experience of life and faith and the intertwinement of all of that. God, would you give us the graciousness and the kindness to look back and to be able to allow for things and places that are not where we were anymore, but to allow for some gratitude for experiences that we had there. God, for things where there is not gratitude, but instead there is trauma and harm that was done, would you give us the space to heal and the courage to pursue that healing? And God, would you give us, may we be a people who have eyes, but who don't fail to see, who have ears, but don't fail to hear. May we be a people who are just simply open to the new ways that you might move and work in us, open to the ways that our faith might continue to evolve and change, and open to the ways that you might grow us in our next season, not being disdainful of the season that we were in or where we came from, but hopeful and encouraged by where we might go. And so, good and gracious God, give us those eyes to see. And we pray it in the name of Jesus. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Mike. Would you stand for this last song? I chose this one because of what's happening on Tuesday. It's about love. And so the prayer when you're singing this song is that you'll feel this towards the stranger, towards the other, towards the friend or family who's in the opposite political camp. You can just love them anyway.
Thank you. You've given us so many things to think about and permission to be present where we are and to look with grace and love upon our past and hope into our future. So thank you. We have lots to talk about in group. For those of you who are in groups, we're going to have a whole 2 pages of questions, so get ready. Yes, and Tuesday's a big day. May love run deeply through us, from God to us, and through us. It's a big day. We'll be praying for all of you. I know many of us have family and friends on all different sides, and it's hard. So may you know you are loved. May you know God is walking with you through this season, and may we receive that love and share it well with others. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I hope you have a wonderful week. Be well.